Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Back Log Banter. My name is Tucker Hazel. Today, I am joined by my co-host, Abram Buhner, who takes his rod with him everywhere he goes. And today, we're here to talk
Of
about The
course.
Legend of Zelda: Echoes of Wisdom, our thoughts on this game, and the interesting design implications that this there game sort of has. But Abram, the floodgates are finally being opened. We've been playing this game for almost 2 weeks now. We've both finished it. And I'm mostly here to support you along your journey to talk about this game because I think you got a lot of thoughts on it.
Yeah, I do. I played a lot of it the last couple days on my great journey here to my currently empty
Yes.
home.
Yeah, you love the
Um,
set design, production design.
yeah, it's really nice,
Oh,
isn't
look,
it?
a
I got a nice
vacuum.
red curtain in front of me, making me red. You got a red curtain in the
Yeah,
background. This room's actually very America
yeah.
colored,
White and gray.
um, and
Yeah.
gray. I love Echoes of Wisdom. I really love it a lot. It's my favorite game of the year, and I currently have it number 6 in my overall
Yeah.
Zelda ranking.
Which is just a
Um,
testament to how much you love Zelda. Yes.
yes,
Because six is not like top, but like also there's a shitload of Zelda games.
yeah. It's just outside my highest tier of
Hmm.
Zelda. It is above Tears of the Kingdom, and I feel like
Wow.
we're going to be putting both these games, there
Yeah.
it is, in conversation a lot in this review, because they're obviously part of this same larger new continuity and new design philosophy for Zelda, begun with
Mm. Breath of the Wild. I was just
A Legend of Zelda: A Link Between Worlds on
Oh, I
Nintendo
actually don't have a physical
3DS.
copy of that. I do actually. I don't have a box. I just have the cartridge,
That's fair
which is
enough.
really frustrating me. I feel like I need to go back and fill in some like. That's how sick I am. That's how fucked in the head I am. I'm like, I need to buy like the box for like Superstar Ultra. I have the cartridge, but I digress. Continue.
I I was really interested in the Ask the Developer interview that came out before this
Yeah.
game was
Weren't
released,
there
and we're
two? Weren't
hearing
there a couple?
it was a big old four-parter
Hmm.
released over 3 days. And we heard a lot from the first-time directors of this game, Terada and
Mm-hmm.
Sano, but we also heard quite a bit from Aonuma
Yeah.
as well. And hearing them talk a lot about the ways in which this idea of, as they say, letting the player be
Sure.
mischievous, solving
Yeah.
puzzles in ways that almost seem like cheating, is now, in fact, what Zelda
Hmm.
is. I thought that was a really interesting insight from
Yeah.
Aonuma. But intriguingly, at the same time, I think that the future of Zelda isn't only in that idea, but it's actually, in some ways, in a
Hmm.
regression to what Zelda used to
Sure.
be. Because we saw in Tears of the Kingdom, and obviously far more so in Echoes of
Yeah.
Wisdom, a return to traditional tenets of Zelda, dungeons, old story
Yeah. Yeah.
progression, various facets on like an aesthetic
Mm-hmm.
level, an art direction level that call back to the older titles. Zelda is both looking ahead and looking
Mm.
behind, and I think that puts Echoes of Wisdom in a very peculiar place I want
Sure.
to discuss. But for me, it makes it a very special game because it channels what I love about pre Breath of the Wild
Yeah.
Zelda, which is the overall majority of my favorite
Mm-hmm.
Zelda experiences, while also, for me, recapturing a lot of what made Breath of the Wild so compelling in a way that I personally didn't think Tears of the Kingdom
Sure.
could.
Yeah, and I think that balance is really what I want to talk about with this game. That I
Yeah,
totally agree, and where I find myself really liking this game. And I think for me, for 2D Zelda, it's probably my third favorite behind Link Between Worlds and Minish Cap. But
yeah,
this
sure.
Minish Cap and Link Between Worlds, all three games that I really like, and I think they all take slightly different approaches, especially to that freedom and the balance in Echoes of Wisdom helped me. And I think the progression from Breath of the Wild to Tears of the Kingdom, which we talked a little bit about in our more in depth review of this game last year,
Yeah,
how it does sort of regress, you say, but this is not meant as like pejorative. It's just a design level change back in the direction of more
yeah,
linearity, stricter dungeon design, item progression, things like that. Uh, the progression from this to this has helped me to appreciate some elements of more traditional Zelda design that is a little bit more linear, a little bit more structured, that I had enjoyed in a few games, but largely felt myself disconnected from. And it wasn't until Echoes of Wisdom where I felt myself enjoying dungeons a lot more than I had in previous Zelda games. And I think this just has one of the best overworlds in a Zelda game. And I love the characters and I love the little side stories and the plot lines and everything. And so I totally agree. I think this is a fantastic game. I have very few major criticisms with it. And I don't guess I don't really have many minor criticisms either. It's just it's a really good game, and I'm very happy that after literally over a decade, we have an original 2D Zelda that feels really unique and melds the two eras of Zelda in a really special way.
I was just this morning. I was reading a piece that Jake Steinberg
Yeah.
wrote about Echoes of
Hmm.
Wisdom, um, actually challenging the idea that you put forth that this game is in fact really original in any
Hmm.
way. And I don't agree with it, but I
Yeah.
thought it was a really interesting argument that Jake put forth. This idea
Future
that
friend of the show, by
in
the way. He is
future friend
scheduled
of
to
the
be
show,
on NS at some point in the future. So I can't say friend
yeah,
of the show, but he will be eventually.
he's putting forth this idea that the game is trading so heavily on
Hmm.
aesthetics
Hmm.
of past Zelda titles, and he gets more into the narrative side of things, which we can touch on
Yeah.
as well. But the idea that it's treading a lot on past tropes and aesthetics of Zelda is sort of in a lot of ways emulate what the series
Hmm.
was without really getting too deep into
Hmm.
it. He sees it as sort of a shallow
Yeah.
game, and I thought that that was an interesting assessment because I feel like on some level he's really not
Hmm.
wrong, but I also think that this is sort of a to me like the ideal way to move Zelda
Sure.
forward and to balance these two different forces I'm talking
Yeah.
about. This desire to return to old Zelda and the desire to capture the the modern sensibility of Zelda, which is more of like a feeling than a
Hmm.
look.
Yeah.
It's this idea of mischief opposed to these
Hmm.
touchstones that define the series in the past. And for me, I think that ultimately where the game succeeds the most and the ways that it does feel unique is how it manages to, yes, pull in and rely on these old Zelda
Yeah.
ideas, and frankly just remix new Zelda
Sure.
concepts, this concept of mischief in an experience that to me feels unique principally because it seems so small and
Hmm.
immediate in a way that I don't think outside of Link's
Yeah.
Awakening a Zelda game has
Hmm.
felt in a
Sure.
decade.
Yeah, and it's that release context that I think,
Yeah,
regardless of how this game feels, if you're playing if you're doing like a 2D Zelda marathon, you're playing all the games
yeah,
back to
sure.
back, or you're really hardcore into Zelda and you've been playing these games forever, and you notice the interesting element that makes Zelda unique, but also can be a sticking point for people is the reliance on tropes and reliance on certain concepts and design ideas and places and races and characters. And Echoes of Wisdom certainly leans back into that. But I think it's interesting that I didn't feel that as a negative. It was almost, to me, this feels like the ideal sort of reboot for any given
Yeah,
game series where there are still the obvious design tenets, structural concepts, locations, things like that, that the series is known for. But the moment to moment I felt was totally paced differently, and my mindset was totally different than I was approaching other Zelda games because of what this game does definitely bring new to the table, which is a very fresh set of
yeah,
gameplay mechanics, combat, puzzle solving, traversal that is okay. Sure, the map has a volcano and a swamp and a desert, but I didn't feel like I was revisiting the same Gerudo town or the same Zora's domain. It was a Zora's domain. It was a castle,
yeah,
castle town. That's what it's called. The little town around Hyrule Castle. Yeah, castle town. Because this game for me was about the small scale, like you were saying. It was about Zelda
yeah,
and the world around her, the immediate surroundings of what am I going to do in this little area? How am I going to get on top of just this one tree? How am I going to scale this 5 block tall cliff? I wasn't really thinking of it in the way that I really appreciated what Tears of the Kingdom did. It gave me sort of this bird's eye view feeling where I was like really able to
yeah.
really take in the breadth of the game. Not the breath though. That's this game. But Echoes of Wisdom is much more to me about the tight knit, just me in whatever room I'm in, which is really really fun.
Yeah, and I want to talk more about that. I have a specific puzzle that I liked so much I screen
Fun.
recorded it on my Switch so I can look back at it. But I think there's one point I want to raise about still this idea of
Hmm.
trope because I think you're totally right to bring up the idea that Zelda as a series is a retold
Yep.
legend. As much as people want to dilute themselves with this whole concept of a
Yeah.
timeline or whatever, in reality, I think the reason that Zelda is so hard to track into a larger narrative is because it exists kind of in the way that like the old Mad Max
Hmm.
movies do, which is to
Yeah.
say we have the same general plot
Hmm.
structure and touchstones, and the idea is that we're retelling a fable for new
Yeah.
generations. And this is definitely much more of
Hmm.
that than either of the other two original Zelda games on
Yeah.
Switch. Um, and I think it invites a potential for this game not to age that
Hmm.
well in my personal
Sure.
ranking. So I think that's an important
Yeah.
caveat to add. You mentioned release timing, and I think that is certainly a factor in how much I like this
Hmm.
game. Um, Definitely amplified by the fact that I am in the contingent of people not super happy with Tears of the
Hmm.
Kingdom. I think Tears of the Kingdom is cool, and it's a game that I look at as much more impressive than personally
Yeah. Sure.
resonant. So I was sort of teed up already to want this
Of
type of game,
course.
and then they delivered this like comfort
Sure.
food Zelda gaming
Yeah.
aesthetics. And when you remove that from the context of me waiting a decade
Hmm.
for it, maybe it seems less impressive
Hmm.
when I have 5 years after release and I'm looking at A Link Between Worlds, my
Yeah.
favorite 2D Zelda title, and this, both of which existing out of their context, I gravitate more towards Link Between
Yeah. Sure.
Worlds over Echoes. I don't
Yeah.
know, but in the moment, I value this return a
Hmm.
lot, in large part because I think it's executed so well. And we can talk about the art direction. We can talk
Yeah.
about the music, but you were talking about this puzzle
Hmm.
solving, and I want to talk about the
Yeah.
immediacy because this is something that's really special. I think the puzzle that I screen recorded that I love is I went into a little
Hmm.
cave and I saw there was a heart piece in here, and there was a wall blocking me from it. There was some boulders I could move with
Hmm.
bind, but I couldn't move them from this
Yeah.
side. I noticed that there was a hole in the ceiling on this side of the room with the heart piece. I went outside and I saw a discolored patch of
Hmm.
grass. So I pulled up I think it's called the whole
Yeah.
mill.
The
The
mole.
Yeah,
Oh wait, whole mill molehill. Holy shit, that's fucking clever.
I'm pretty sure his name is Whole Mill. And I used him on the discolored patch of grass and he dug a hole through a weak
Hmm.
spot and he dropped down. I could drop down after him and grab the heart
Yeah.
piece. This was a very, very quick interaction. It fit into the 30-second screen
Yes.
recording I
Yes.
got, right? And I think that speaks to this very handheld feeling design
Sure.
philosophy of the game, where, and this was proven by the way I was playing it in sort of fits and spurts while I was
Hmm.
moving. You can jump into it, you can solve a couple small puzzles, you can jump out. It feels very
Hmm.
modular and it feels super
Oh, interesting.
quick.
Yeah.
And I think that that's something that for me didn't work so well for Tears of the
Hmm.
Kingdom when I felt like, okay, I need to sit down and I need to build this big Zonai
Sure.
contraption,
Yeah.
right? There's no contraption building in
Yeah.
this game. In a lot of ways, the echoes are like an extended set of key
Hmm.
items. A lot of the
Oh,
echoes actually
absolutely.
just serve the function of Link's
Yeah.
key
Yeah.
items in the old
And I certainly
games.
want to talk about the item progression of
Yeah.
this game because I think it's a really interesting facet of it. But yeah, I
Yeah.
totally agree. I think immediacy is really interesting because I think I can tie this back to what I was saying earlier about Acts of Wisdom sort of teaching me how to appreciate dungeon design or enjoy them a little bit more. Because I think that
Sure.
this game's dungeons, because of the mechanics you're given through the echoes and the fact that you have all these options at any given moment, and you can kind of approach it in the way that you want to. Do you like to use a combination of stools and trees or beds or water blocks or whatever?
We
Um,
love stool.
ding, cinema sins. Cinema sins is in that you committed a sin, you kind of cursed almost. But one of my problems with Zelda dungeon design of previous games, is that in games like Link to the Past or Ocarina of Time, the dungeon itself is one massive puzzle. You are working towards getting the water flow to change so you can get down this path. You're working towards changing like the world around you
Yeah.
to continue forward and to complete one big thing, and then you get moved to move on to the next segment. And where I personally prefer my puzzle solving is in the more intricate, fine moments of not trying to get one orb to carry it across the dungeon to place it on the pedestal to then continue forward, but complete this one room, move on to the next room. And I'm currently playing Silent Hill 2 Remake, which I think does that very well. Which is there's like a big puzzle. You have like in the game there's like a jukebox, and you have to find the one half of the record, and you have to find the coin to put in it, and you have to find the glue to glue the record back together. And I'm not thinking about the whole I need to get this jukebox done. I need to find this one thing. I need to find the glue. And I think Echoes of Wisdom does that. In I never felt like I needed to solve 6 rooms at once to like cascade and then solve the puzzle to move me forward. It was, I'm locked in this room. What am I going to do to get myself out of this room with the ideas and the opportunities I've been given? And that kind of more immediate puzzle solving, I think, is much more gratifying to me on a personal level. Is like, rather than using my own ingenuity, and I think to the idea of mischief that Aonuma and the Grezzo producers were talking about, the mischief and the ingenuity that comes out of all 3 of these games is I agree with Aonuma. That to me is Zelda, is using what
Yeah.
you're given and your understanding of the mechanics to move forward, is why I personally love Tears of the Kingdom, but and why I enjoy these games largely more than older Zelda design. Although there are older Zelda games that I really love. I think it's really, really special how it seems like they've rethought puzzle pacing, which is, it's kind of
Yeah.
something that's hard to like nail down. But I think it on a like mental level, I really, really feel that. In fact,
Yeah, it's interesting because you were mentioning before you don't feel like you have that many major issues with the game. I do. I actually have a lot of
cool.
problems with it. But I think that in the macro sense, it doesn't matter because the feel of the adventure, as I want to talk about, is just so
Hmm.
good. But the dungeons are something that, to me, they still haven't figured out how to
Hmm.
nail in this modern
Sure.
era of
Yeah.
Zelda. I think they've gotten progressively
Yeah. Yeah.
better across these 3
Hmm.
games, but I don't think they've cracked it for me because I agree with you about the pace. I think the pace of the dungeons is very
Yeah.
good. There's less moments here where you're sort of um, finding yourself needing to open up the
Hmm.
map and look at what doors are still locked and look at how you can maybe go back through old rooms in new
Hmm.
ways. You're right that there's not so much of a macro view in these dungeons. It's a lot more about an individual room puzzle, and I
Yeah.
think that also is quite satisfying. Again, with this theme of immediacy
Sure.
throughout all the puzzles, but I still feel like you need to have a more macro view as well. And the later dungeon in this game
Hmm.
do. The dungeon I did last, which was up on top of Hebra
Hmm.
Mountain, I think easily the best dungeon in the
Yeah. Yeah.
game
Totally agree.
because it both had these smaller, simpler single room puzzles to solve, but there was this larger overarching
Yeah. Yeah.
gimmick as well.
Of
There
melting and freezing.
obviously is
Yeah.
using the melting and
Hmm.
freezing orbs, and I feel like for most of the dungeons in this game are kind of lacking
Hmm.
that. It sort of is just about, okay, let's hit the switch, let's defeat the
Yeah.
enemies, let's figure out how to cross this gap. These smaller puzzles that don't amount to much, and this is where I think the familiar aesthetics do hurt the game
Okay.
because when I'm both in another Goron
Yeah.
temple, I'm in another water temple, but they sort of lack the interesting design that or the iconic design of like Ocarina of Time or Twilight Princess versions of either
Hmm.
of these aesthetic
Hmm.
dungeons, or Wind Waker. I love the Fire Wind Waker temple. I think you lose something. I sort of feel that's where I feel like I'm most going through the
Mm.
motions, not
Sure.
because the pace of
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
puzzles are bad or because any individual puzzle is bad, but because they're not particularly
Yeah.
remarkable until you get to that last dungeon. It really does feel like on a macro level, the game gets a lot better
Hmm.
as you go through it.
Interesting. Yeah.
And I think you spend, in my opinion, almost a little bit too much time in the first half of the game in particular, just doing the same simple
Hmm.
actions to sort of acclimate the player to the echoes and to everything, which I think is
Yeah.
fine. But all the really good stuff I think is in
Hmm.
that really
Hmm.
back third of the game. Um, and so I still think that that Grezzo and EBD3 have to keep sort of tuning how you balance this new open-ended approach to puzzle solving with these larger dungeon
Sure.
gimmicks that can make the overarching dungeon experience, I think, feel a little bit more
Yeah.
memorable.
Fair
Like
enough.
I've
Yeah.
not played all the way through Wind
Hmm.
Waker literally in close to a
Hmm.
decade, but I can still very clearly remember the light reflection puzzles with Medley in one of the dungeons, or the using my climbing rope to
Yeah,
swing around in its fire temple, or climbing up the Deku tree and everything like that. These particular moments that will always stick with me, even if I don't replay the
sure,
game in literally 10
sure.
years. I don't think Echoes of Wisdom has that many of
I
those.
yeah, I totally agree, and I think that I can reach across the internet scape and shake your hand on that because the way you just described the dungeons in this is maybe unfairly, but just on a guttural level, how I largely feel about dungeons in all Zelda games. There are really no moments of any of the Zelda games I've completed, which is over half a dozen. I've finished quite a
Yeah,
few Zelda games. There are no dungeon moments that are my favorite moments or even particularly memorable moments for me from any Zelda game that I've played. It really to me is about the overworld is about the interacting with characters and
yeah,
completing little side quests and finding a little hidden thing as you solve a hidden puzzle mostly in the overworld as opposed to the dungeon structure which again I was taught to better appreciate it in this game. But I also agree. I think that the dungeons are not the best part of this game, and I think that a lot of them do end up feeling similar. Because to your
yeah,
point, it really isn't until that last dungeon where there is like a given mechanic that really feels like it has its own identity. But I agree with that sentiment, but I don't agree with it only for this. I agree with it for all of Zelda games.
sure.
But I think again, what makes Zelda games special to me and why it's a series that I love and why I love this game is because I think this game understands the idea of adventuring through the overworld and hidden secrets and understanding the terrain and exploration. That to me, Zelda is about exploration. It's not about puzzle solving. It's not about dungeons. It's about the open air adventure, which I think all three of these games do exceptionally well. And for me, why Echoes of Wisdom and Link Between Worlds are my parallel two favorites of 2D Zelda is they are able to, because of the freedom that they inject through Echoes or the rental mechanic, I guess it's called in
Yeah,
Link Between Worlds, they add a freedom that I think enhances my internal drive to do exploration and to just dick around and find things. And I did a lot of this in Echoes of Wisdom. And the reason why I will like at face value disagree with you that the game gets like exceptionally more better as it goes on because I did most of my favorite parts of this game in like the first few hours of the game, but it's because
sure.
as soon as I had the ability to, I just went off. I explored almost the entire map. I uncovered almost every single hidden little section of the map really really early on in the game. Before I'd even done no, actually no, before I'd even completed like so the game is structured in an interesting way where it does like a mini Breath of the Wild Tears of the Kingdom thing where there's a half linear structure to the way that you're supposed to go through these dungeons and half not. So you have to do the first two in order. Then there are two that you can do in any order. Then there's a mid game one that you have to do, and then it unlocks three more, and then there's a final one that you have to do. And so
Yeah.
I explored almost the entire map and talked to almost every character before completing the third dungeon, which you can choose which one that is. But that was my favorite part of this game was exploring this map, which I really, really love. And I did that early on, but it's because that was the order that I wanted to do things, and not necessarily that that's because that's how the game is paced. It's how you can pace the game yourself.
Yeah, I mean, I was playing much more linearly almost.
Yeah.
I was saying, okay, I'm on my way to go to the Zora
Hmm.
domain. I'm just gonna explore, but I'm just gonna explore this quadrant of the map. When I'm done with the Zora temple, then and um, I'm moving over. I guess at that point, I was going to Hyrule Castle, then the top dungeons. But basically, I'd say, okay, my next dungeon's in this part of the map. I'm just gonna traverse this whole part of the map back and forth, do its main quest, and keep moving. So, and it's maybe, I guess, then maybe it's not that the game gets better as it goes on, or it almost like just gets better as you go north, to a certain
Sure.
extent, because they definitely ask you to be more deliberate or at least more engaged in how you're
Mm.
traversing when you're like getting up
Yeah.
north.
Yeah. Sure.
Climbing the mountain is
Yeah.
fantastic, and that is a very involved
Yeah. Definitely.
process. And that's where I think that the game, in terms of overworld exploration, is truly
Hmm.
excellent because it's not only just asking you to find your own way through even terrain, it's asking you to find your way through these like almost curated kind of platforming
I want
segments.
to talk about that. Yeah. because I think that that's
And
what makes this game feel really unique to me as a Zelda game. In the way
yeah,
that I liked a lot of the Sky Islands in Tears of the Kingdom and a lot of the specific dungeon moments in Tears of the Kingdom is because there is actually like platforming in this game, but in a context of an open world where you have the paraglider and you have ascend, and so you have this sort of like pseudo exploration platforming that this game does. But Echoes of Wisdom takes that concept, and I think more so than any other Zelda game previously, injects basically just straight up platforming segments into the game in two different areas, which I think is really, really nice. You get the I'm gonna call them rift dungeons, I guess. There are these
yeah,
mini rift dungeon segments where you are dropped into a section of the stilled world, which is, I guess, this game's equivalent of a dark world or something like that, or a low world. And you have to find the tries. There's just like tries hidden around, and none of these are particularly difficult. But I found them to be very, very fun because they were basically just Zelda 3D platform like collectathon areas, and I was like,
yeah,
wait, this is
yeah.
awesome. Like this is totally different from anything I've done in previous Zelda games. And so there's that, which is 3D platforming, and then there's also 2D platforming mixed in, not only in caves but also in the dungeons. And so then you're doing you're like Donkey Kong Jr. style, jumping between ropes, and you're like using the echoes
Yeah.
in a 2D space, which kind of keys you into a different way to sort of think about them. That injection of puzzle platforming is really, really cool, and I think it's actually one of my favorite elements of this game.
Yeah, it's interesting because like Breath of the Wild introducing the free and permanent
Yeah.
jump was done in the context of a
In
world
previous
that is
games, you had to
complete
pay 20 cents every time you jumped.
every time you hit the button. Um, it was done in the context of a very natural
Yeah,
world. Obviously, I mean that's my favorite thing about Breath of the
totally.
Wild is the way it just simply feels like you're existing in
Mhm,
nature in that game. This game is very toy box
mhm.
like. It's people say like, oh, the Link's Awakening engine in general is toy
Yeah.
like, and that's definitely true. But Link's Awakening was not designed quite like a toy box the same way this
Mhm,
game is.
totally.
That game on Game Boy was still trying to emulate this feeling of a real
Yeah,
world, for as imaginative as
yeah.
it is. In this game, I think you can really see Grezzo's design philosophy as saying, okay, well, we want to craft these areas that just exist as obstacle
Mhm,
courses in the still world. And I think that that's really
yeah.
intriguing because it's not something you really get that much of in Zelda. Zelda's rarely about these sorts of
Mhm,
areas. It's mostly about creating these natural fantasy
mhm.
landscapes. Rock's Feather and Link's Awakening it's maybe the
Yeah,
closest, but I really liked it too. I agree with you. It's like sort of Super Mario
sure.
Sunshine. It's sort of as you're saying like the climb up to some of the temples in Tears of the Kingdom. And yeah, I really liked it a lot too. I think that this is where I think it's actually where one of the biggest contentions with this game is
Okay. Well,
introduced.
can I stay on
Um,
the toy box thing real
yeah,
quick?
yeah,
Take your idea you were just about to say, contention, stick it in your ear, remember that for a little bit later. But the toy box thing, because I think you
yeah,
really just clued me in on something I think is really, really special about this game, is Link's Awakening has a toy box art. The remake has a toy box art style. He's a plasticky
yeah,
little guy. Everything's kind of got this little, like, almost stop motion animation to it. I think it's really cool. It looks really good. But I think why that aesthetic for me works a lot better in Echoes of Wisdom. I also think that art direction is slightly stronger here. It's not like they're very different, but I think it's slightly stronger.
yeah,
But it's because I think it matches the mechanics a lot better. And the idea of being a kid and playing with toys, I think, is really recaptured in this game. In that you're a kid, you build a Lego fortress, you build a Lego ship, you build a little town. You've got your action figure from another series. You got your Star Wars guy. You've got your race car, whatever, and you're just kind of smashing them together and you're having fun. The idea of just anything in your imagination can come to
yeah,
life. Obviously, with the echoes, that's it's be imaginative. Use anything from anywhere on the map. Like it's basically like this is gonna be really weird. It's basically like making a ransom letter out of cutting bits from other
yeah,
magazines
yeah,
of
yeah,
like these are from other places in the map. You've got the goo guys from down here, you've got the water block from here, and you're mashing them all together, you're messing around. And so from the puzzle solving element, because of the echoes, it has the Legos mixed with Lego Mega Blocks mixed with the wood blocks that you have from your grandma. Like it's got that sort of toy box element to it, but it also has the freedom of a toy box in that in previous Zelda games you were locked to there's a forest, here are the line of trees that you can't go anywhere past the line of trees. There's nothing there. But in this game, it's like
Yeah.
again back to the toy box thing. You're a kid. There's a wall. You're playing with your toy. You pick up the guy. You put him on top of the wall, and you keep going. You can leave the bounds of the area that your little world exists in, and put your little action figure up on top of a shelf, on top of the fan, on like into the fish tank, whatever. And I think that element of being able to break free from this is a cliff, you can't go up there. Too bad.
Yeah.
Here's a forest that doesn't mean anything. You're jaunting on top of the trees like half of the time in this game. You're screwing your way up a cliff and finding your way like around the back side of a town in a way that the game kind of didn't intend, but it has that sort of do what you want because it's kind of goofy and silly.
Well, they were talking about this in the Ask the Developer interview as well. This idea of like, at first, the game had a lot of restrictions on
Mhm.
you, and over time, they realized we got to lift more and lift more and lift more and let the player basically cheat because that's fun for some people. And what you're describing actually is it works out nicely because it's what I wanted to talk
Okay,
about with
cool.
the contentious element. Because let me tell you a little bit how I would play with
Mhm.
toys when I was a kid. There were rules
Yeah.
to it. I was mostly playing with Star Wars toys. I had these toys called a Tactics. It was mostly for this game where you had Star Wars toys, and they had like little clickers in them. You could click them certain number of spaces across the table, and then they had like launchers you could shoot and try to knock
I've
each
never
other
heard of
over.
this. Star Wars Tactics?
A
Attack
Tactics,
like just a like portmanteau of those two words? I'll look
yeah,
it. I'll
because
figure it out. I'm just because I can't
like
even really.
attack and
Yeah, I got it.
tactics, and also like tick because it made this ticking noise as you move them.
Okay.
Instead of actually playing with the game, from the most part, I would
Oh,
take the
there's an X.
figures,
Tactics.
yeah, and I'd put them around my house and just have them shoot at each other and like make these elaborate stories with
Hmm.
them. But I was always very careful to make sure that everybody was included, and the ones that were overpowered in the actual game weren't just ruining my imaginary
Hmm.
story as well. And the Wookiees lived in my mom's plant because I was most like
Yeah.
Kashyyyk, and the ground troops are over this part of the living room. And for me, part of the fun was really setting up something
Yeah.
elaborate. But Echoes of Wisdom is somewhat similar to this idea of playing the way you're talking about, of saying fuck it, everybody is colliding together, they can go wherever, you can put them in the fish
Yeah.
tank,
Yeah.
you can just do whatever, or you can really make something more
Yeah.
sensible, or I guess like
Coherent. Yeah.
internally
Hmm.
coherent. In this game there's a similar tension, and equally self-imposed, between playing the game
Yeah.
efficiently or playing the game more
Sure.
creatively. And this is something we talked a little bit
Hmm.
about, as when we were both still playing the game. Like when you're playing with your toys, Echoes of Wisdom asks you to really be the author of the
Sure. Yeah.
experience. And this is just a design
Hmm.
philosophy. I don't know if it's one I
Sure.
prefer, but it's the one
Yes.
employed here. Echoes of Wisdom puts you in a position where, to have, I in my from my view, the most fun, you have to object to the most effective
Hmm.
solutions. If you have to get up a wall, um or clear examples, if you're trying to get across a gap, the easiest thing to do is just to stack
Hmm.
beds end for end,
Yeah.
and you just walk
Hmm.
across them. And there's gonna be a contingent of people that find that fun, and that's great, and that's fine. But for me, I say to myself, okay, well, in the rules of my head, in my toy box Echoes of Wisdom, that's kind of
Yeah. Sure.
boring. What I'd rather do is figure out another way to get across. Maybe I use my far-reaching
Hmm.
echo to put a fish on the other side of the gap, and then I summon a crow. The crow goes to eat the fish. I
Oh,
bind
fun. Yeah.
onto the crow. The crow goes to the
Yeah.
fish. He carries me across. I was able to say, look, it's less important for me to play the game efficiently than it is for me to play the game in a more fun
Sure.
way.
Yeah.
I'm going to go ahead and make those choices the
Hmm.
same way I choose to only let the Wookiees live on my mom's
Yeah.
planet because it's most like their home planet. I don't know how good of a job Echoes of Wisdom does of encouraging you to
Yeah.
play this
Sure.
way.
Totally fair.
It
Yeah.
presents you with so many of these same type of problems that can so easily be
Hmm.
cleared with the same g- generic
Yeah.
solutions, and I mean generic in the sense that
It's
they're
like there's like
universally
5
applicable.
echoes that are really useful for traversal. You got the
Yeah,
beds,
and
you got well, I mean, the first part of the game, it's like the stools and the block in the boxes, but those go quickly bye-bye. You got the beds, the water blocks, and the clouds. Those are easily the best ones. And you got the
yeah,
platforms.
and the crawlchula who'll just crawl up at any wall.
I don't even know if I ever
Um,
used that. Wait.
he's like the spider, and you bind to him, and he'll just like walk up a wall. I used the
Yeah, I've never
crawlchula a
even
lot.
I don't even, I don't even know if I had that one.
And it's interesting because in the spirit of what you're discussing, which I love and I agree with, this idea that it is just this toy box but making your own
Mhm.
rules. It makes me wonder what the role of criticizing the design is, or really
Hmm.
how the design can even be
Hmm.
criticized when there are these OP pieces at
Yeah.
play. I was watching Arlo's video where he was talking about how everything is just putting down
Mhm.
beds. And that's true if you only put down
Correct, yes.
beds. But then is it a skill issue on your behalf if you're doing that and not having
Yeah.
fun? Or is it Nintendo's fault and Grezzo's fault for not crafting maybe more exciting puzzle
Hmm.
opportunities where you can't
Yeah,
just do
yeah.
that? I don't
No,
really
yeah.
know.
And that's what makes game design discussion equal parts fascinating and frustrating. And I've certainly had these experiences where in my experience, usually from the more negative side or the more criticism side, like you were talking about with Arlo talking about, oh, there's just one solution, it's not great, but I just keep doing it. Game design is about the design mixed with the aspirations and the engagement of the player, and so one solution that you're given 3 options to, it also depends on which ones you like. Because you're like, because as you said, like some people might find stacking beds on top of each other because it is a goofy, ridiculous thing. That's like a meme about this game.
Yeah.
It can be fun. It can be something like this is so silly and stupid and it looks goofy and it is kind of cool that I get to put these down and sort of Minecraft my way across this gap. That can be super engaging to someone. Or it can be the more boring solution when you present the other options. As you're saying, you can just summon a guy, make him follow the thing, build your own little Rube Goldberg machine to get yourself across. Because that's that's what happens when you have options. And to me,
Yeah.
I don't feel this about every game, but I find this about many games that I end up really, really loving, that presenting a set of options and letting me choose from them allows me to feel more connected to the choice that I made, and more
Yeah.
connected to the solution that I found, even though it is technically one of the presented solutions that the game designer had to make to allow that to happen. I feel like as you were saying, mischievous, Aonuma, all these words colliding together, Tears of the Kingdom, Breath of the Wild, Ascend, all these things. Echoes of Wisdom does that, and I think that this game, to me, unlike Tears of the Kingdom and Breath of the Wild, it obviously has a more limited set of things that you can do, just because it's in a 2D space. But that's honestly, that's even not really true. It really is a 3D Zelda game because you are thinking about things in a 3 dimensional space. It's really interesting. The title of this video, Echoes of Wisdom, is a 3D Zelda game. Hmm.
Well, 2D Zelda has never been a good
Sure,
descriptor.
but I mean, you've never been able to really think about things in a 3D space in the same way in previous 2D Zelda games.
It depends. I mean, even in Link Between Worlds, with going on the wall,
Oh,
they're
sure.
already
Yeah,
introducing
yeah,
the
I guess that is, yeah.
axis.
But that's
But
also
I
another 2D
think,
play. Hmm.
I mean, more precisely, these are just like
Yeah, top
isometric
down
Zelda
is
games.
correct delineation.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's
But
yeah.
I don't even know where I was going with that because I got stuck up on the idea that this is not a 2D
No,
Zelda game.
no. I mean, it's. I think you're making a good point. This ultimately this is this idea that you become married to the choices
Mhm.
you make, and they're your choices, and you feel agency over
And
them. And I
sometimes
think that
divorce is
that's true.
necessary.
I totally agree. I feel like there's a non sequitur.
You said marriage. I was just,
I I think where I come down on it is like there there's one portion of the game where you get thrown in
Yeah.
jail by the Deku
Mhm.
Scrubs, and you have to escape by binding. By using bind on just what's in the
Mhm.
environment. There's another part of the game in Kakariko Village where you can do these like dream challenges where you can only echo the things that are
Yeah.
actually in
Yeah.
the room. And what I find myself wondering about is there a version of this game that's better because it imposes these restrictions on you
Definitely
more?
possible. Yeah, totally.
Because I think the problem becomes when you have this ultimate freedom, you just start eating candy over and over
Sure.
again. You can't be given candy all the time, or it doesn't become as special or as
Mm-hmm.
tasty. And when this game always says, okay, you can always have your entree, you can always have your
Mm-hmm.
candy, and you keep going for candy, at a certain
You get
point,
tired of candy.
that's Nintendo's
Yeah.
fault for just giving you
Sure. Fair
candy.
enough.
I think that there would maybe a version of the game where in dungeons, and you come up with some silly
Yeah. They put
rationale.
like some razor blades in the candy or something.
Yeah, there's like a fucking
Fent in the
magic
candy.
dome. There's they give try Fent when you walk into the temple, and then try can't
Yeah. Yeah.
summon
Yeah.
shit for you for a little bit or whatever. Like, I think there's a world where in the overworld is this big fun toy
Mm-hmm.
box, and then these more curated
Yeah.
dungeon or just underworld environments are more intentionally designed, not to where every puzzle just has one solution, but to where they restrict your set of possibilities to force you to think differently and apply your logic in different
Sure.
ways. I think that's
Yeah.
something that
Hmm.
shrines do really
Definitely.
well.
Yeah.
They ask you to take the like neural pathways you formed in other parts of the game and apply them
Yeah.
differently.
In
There's
those
nothing
games,
like that in this
it's
game.
specific because it's specifically because in the overworld you're doing a lot of climbing. There's no climbing
Right.
allowed in shrines, and that's something I've kind of internalized. But it is obviously a very deliberate design decision to prevent you
Yeah.
from like the solution to almost everything in the overworld of both Tears of the Kingdom and Breath of the Wild is just climb up it. Like you use Rivali's Gale, literally grip your way up a wall. But this game does not have largely those moments of changing the rules to help you engage
Yeah.
with the rules in a different way, which I think is an interesting choice. And I agree that some of the more memorable moments of the game are when they change up those rules. But this game is pretty committed to its own
Yeah.
ridiculous internal logic where it doesn't feel the need to change that logic in moments, which I think would have been interesting. But I agree with you, especially about those little dream challenge rooms. I remember getting really excited when I did that. I'm like, this is really clever. Like it's
Yeah.
I think I described it to you as especially like the first one I did, like a uh yeah, an
Eventide.
Eventide Island where you are stripped back to your basics and you have to sort of build your way back up, that I thought was really, really clever. And I like told that to you. I'm like, you're gonna love this, and obviously you did really enjoy it,
I did.
because it is something that is different. But they just don't seem to
Yeah.
employ that particularly often in this game.
I'm just gonna
Great.
shift gears. What do you think about Zelda?
Uh, she's fine. I mean, I think to me, I like the narrative of this game and the characterization of Zelda, and
Yeah.
I use some half-hearted air quotes as I'm saying both of those things more than I do most other Zelda games because it just is different that you are playing as Zelda and she has a different background than Link, who, while there are many Links and they have slightly different backgrounds, really the only ones with backgrounds that I find interesting are the ones where Link and Zelda have a relationship, like in Skyward Sword or
Sure.
in Breath of the Wild / Tears of the Kingdom. I think that both of those games introduce a Link that I think is more personable because he has an origin story of sorts, whereas other Zelda games take the approach of, as in some ways this game is like a mirror of, Link is a kid from a small town and he's got a sword and he's mute. And he just wakes up one day and he goes on an adventure, or like someone tells him to go on this adventure, and he's like, "All right."
Yeah.
And I've always found that really unengaging. One of my favorite parts about Wind Waker or Ocarina of Time or Link Between Worlds isn't Link; it's finding a funny character that has a funny little story. Uh,
Yeah.
but Echoes of Wisdom, I think, does just enough to twist that. It has a very basic narrative. Zelda is once again a mute protagonist, and she doesn't have a particularly, like, you won't get a lot of characterization for her. But the fact that she is the princess of Hyrule, she obviously has a very different set of abilities, which is kind of here nor there, for the narrative side or the characterization side. Well, actually, no, it's pretty important. I think we should get to that. But the fact that she is the princess, that she has this dynamic with the father, with her father, with the guards, with the minister left and General Wright, and that she has a different sense of assistance to the citizens of Hyrule because she is the princess, and some of them know that she's the princess, some of them don't. That is just enough extra texture for me to appreciate the moment to moment interactions with any given character,
Yeah.
or to better appreciate the sort of just general basic context of this game. Um, but at the end of the day, it's still not particularly strong. I just think that it's a new generic starting point. This is like playing the Link to the Past of games where you play as Zelda, where it's not like I'm not like
Yeah.
glowing about it, but because I mean Link to the Past probably felt super fresh when people played that back in the day, and this feels just fresh enough to where I appreciate that about this game.
Yeah, I don't know. I think the story is
Okay,
bad. I just because I think you're right in this. I really like how you've put it. This idea for it being like a new generic baseline for Zelda
yeah,
stories. I guess in that that's like a low
yeah. Oh,
praise, pretty
I'm not.
much.
Yeah, I'm not saying I love this. I
Yeah,
just think But here's the thing: it fits into Zelda because the Zelda series seems intent on not giving you outside of like I guess Skyward Sword like a really and I haven't played Twilight Princess. I think that one has a little bit more involved like background starting narrative whatever. But most Zelda games are you're just a kid and you wake up and then there's the adventure. And so this
yeah.
is that. So it fits into Zelda and it's something I don't love about Zelda, but it makes sense why they would do that for a Zelda game.
I mean, yeah. Like Twilight Princess definitely is much more concerned with its narrative and
Hmm.
characters and themes than like any other game in the
Yeah.
series. Outside of maybe like Tears of the Kingdom and maybe
Yeah.
Skyward Sword, but not even because Skyward Sword you're just fucking walking around with fire for a lot of the game. Um, I I think it's bad because we shouldn't like if you're gonna do the Zelda game
Hmm.
finally. I feel like she shouldn't be outshone by her appearances in other games, which I think is
Oh,
definitely the
absolutely.
case.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think I could probably give you like maybe half a dozen instances of her being a more interesting character in their own
Absolutely.
game. Wind
Yeah.
Waker, Ocarina of
Absolutely.
Time, Spirit Tracks, Skyward Sword, and Tears of the
Yep.
Kingdom. So 5, and I guess maybe Breath of the Wild. So
Yeah.
I'll give you 6. I think that that's not
Yeah.
great. Um, but I also don't pay attention to stories in
Sure.
games almost ever unless like Naughty Dog
Yeah.
is
Yeah.
making the game
Yeah.
because I also
But
feel
you're like
like
sitting there, you're playing through like Immortality, and you're like, "Oh, what the fuck is this? I just keep pressing A."
there's another example. I but I also feel like the my my standard for a Zelda story is
Hmm.
different, but not lowered the way that you're
Mm.
suggesting. I think you're right, by the way, of thinking for the Zelda series about as
Yeah.
good as you can
Yeah.
expect. In
Hmm.
average, like if you average out the whole series, even though they've been progressively better
Sure.
about having more engaging narrative since
Yeah.
Twilight
Sure.
Princess. But to me, Breath of the Wild has my favorite story in all of
Mm.
Zelda, but not because of the memories of which I basically collected none of. But, but because to me, the story was when I started the game and I went to
Yeah.
Laurelin Village before
Hmm.
Kakariko and overcoming these major tests of strength
Yeah.
shrines and fighting against the rain to climb this mountain. And when I encountered a Lionel, like, this is my
Yeah.
story. I felt like Tears of the Kingdom tried too hard to recreate that
Hmm.
for me because, as we learned from Ayanuma and Fujibayashi in interviews, the ways like this social media
Mm.
quality of Breath of the Wild motivate a lot of design in Tears of the
Yeah.
Kingdom almost made me feel like when this is such a stupid comparison, the screenwriters for Sonic the Hedgehog 2 leaned into what Jim Carrey did in Sonic the Hedgehog 1 and tried to make it the bit.
Okay. I don't remember them saying that, but I believe you. And get
I
ready for
felt
Sonic
like
the Hedgehog 3 in theaters this Christmas.
I felt like Breath of the Wild was this amazing open-ended experience that you had to find the
Sure.
possibilities
Yeah.
of. When I was playing Tears of the Kingdom, for me, it was like I was constantly being nudged by, "Hey, recreate that feeling by making the Zonai
Hmm.
thing." That didn't feel as organic
Sure.
to me. It felt more
Yeah, because
manufactured.
those are like tools. They're not organic.
There was
Yeah, they're
tools,
inorganic.
it was work, it was engineering. In Echoes of Wisdom, I actually felt the same sensibility as in Breath of the
Mm.
Wild, and so that moment of solving the problem with the whole mill, or the ways I learned that I could use a fish to bait
Mhm.
these flying creatures to go someplace for me to follow them, or any of these
Yeah.
moments, or when I was out of my sword fighter meter fighting fighting one of the bosses in the Farron Temple, and I had to just dodge around and use my dark
Yeah.
nut to beat the boss and get
You
clever with
used
it.
that
Like
on
to
me quite a
me,
bit. All
yeah,
right,
that's
can I
true.
continue?
To me, that's the
Sure,
story
absolutely.
of
Yeah.
this game, and I like that. And I know that it's simple, I know that it's stupid, but the idea that the whole gameplay loop revolves around embodying the Triforce of wisdom, to me, is enough
Yeah.
of a
Yeah.
story to have me
Yeah,
feel
and
complete.
I think that I want to touch on two things. I want that last bit I think is great, and that kind of where I backtracked earlier, where I was saying the abilities actually. I don't know why I said it that they weren't a part of her characterization, because I think they absolutely are, because I think they
Yeah,
connect you to her in a different way than the traditional Zelda mechanics connect you to Link. Courage versus wisdom, and now I cannot wait for the game where you play as Ganon and you have power. I don't know what it'd be like. It would be like a beat 'em up. It'd be like Bayonetta or something like that. That'd be awesome. Um,
yeah, it'd be like a game where you play as Gandalf and you're like in these battlefields and you're commanding troops and you're fighting hundreds of enemies in combos.
so that's really cool. But I think also, just to quickly close up the sort of characterization of Zelda, my my praise for the story of this game, for the narrative that and characterization of Zelda, is that it feels right for Zelda, and it's just fresh enough for Zelda to where I appreciate it. But it is also something that I levy criticism against in the uh tropiness and safeness of the narratives in Mario games and also in Pokemon games, where I feel that the fact that they they play it safe and stick to
Yeah.
the same beats is what causes on the narrative side all three of these series to become something that I'm not particularly engaged with. I think that there's a spectrum between. I think Pokemon mixes up the most, Mario mixes up the least, and Zelda's somewhere in the middle. But that's something that I take umbrage with all of them. And my biggest criticism with the sticking to the trope element of Echoes of Wisdom is that Zelda's silent protagonist in this game, because Zelda games have silent protagonists. But I think that's
Yeah.
something that should be thrown out the window. I've always found it incredibly frustrating and hard to connect to Link as a character because he's silent. And I just don't like silent protagonists in general. I don't think there's almost any that I've ever found myself really engaged by. But the problem is, Zelda has always been the more interesting character out of the Link and Zelda pair because she's not silent and because she has a personality and because she is turning into Sheik or has a Tetra alternate personality, or she's a like research oriented person in Breath of the Wild, or in Tears of the Kingdom she has this whole
Yeah.
thing with what are the fucking big ear Raru motherfuckers? Those are Zonai. Oh duh. The Zonai, like, she has a narrative because she's a person interacting with other people in all of these games. But in this, she's silent again. And I was really hoping that it would make her feel more like Zelda if she was talking to these people, if she had lines of dialogue. And it could be pretty stiff, generic stuff. But I don't like the fact that they felt like, okay, well, Zelda games have silent protagonists. Okay, sure, Zelda's talked in the past, but she's the protagonist, so therefore she must be silent. I felt that that was a really big missed opportunity for this game.
Yeah, particularly because of Spirit
Mm-hmm.
Tracks. Like, and like nobody ever
I've
fucking
never
talks
played
about
that
Spirit
game.
Tracks, but Zelda is along with you that whole journey in like the Phantom Armor or
Yeah,
whatever. And she's like quipping along and she's got a real
yeah.
personality. And so I just feel like not having that is a
Mm-hmm.
shame.
Yeah.
I
Yeah,
agree with you.
and the way
It's
that they get around silent protagonists in so many Nintendo games is they give you a little guy. And they give you a little guy in this game as well. Try, not an interesting little guy. I think the design of Try is totally fine. The history with
yeah.
all the Tries and the goddesses and all that's totally fine. But Try is, I mean, basically serves the exact same function personality wise and story wise as Navi does, or as Cappy does, or as any of these fucking little guys that give you an ability do. And that's just something I don't love in these games. And so,
Yeah.
like, even then, I can't even be like, oh well, I guess maybe Phi is slightly more interesting, or like Flood is slightly more interesting on the spectrum of these things. I can't even give this game that praise where it's like, okay, well, Mario or Link are silent protagonists, but or Ezlo, there's a great one. Ezlo is a great little guy that talks for you. Phi is not that in this game, and frankly, I think, or sorry, not Phi, Try I think is on the lower end because Try ends up feeling very stiff. in the way that Navi sometimes can as well in Ocarina of Time, where try ends up mostly being like giving you like the prompts to like move on to the next segment of the game. It's like, all right, Zelda, we finished this up. Let's move on to the next area. Or that person needs help. Let's go make sure we help them. Or the fucking thing, whenever you open a goddamn portal into the rift, it's like, step back, Zelda. I can open a hole into this portal. It's like, I've seen you say that 30 times. Shut the fuck up. I know what it does. So I don't like try, basically, is what I'm saying.
I just like, to me, it's an interesting point of discussion, but to be honest with you, I
Yeah,
just
fair
don't
enough.
care. Like on a very
Yeah.
subjective level, I like at a certain point when the mechanics do the talking, when the Triforce of
Yeah.
Wisdom informs the gameplay, and that as always informs all this
Mm-hmm.
character, it's that thrust for
Yeah.
me works. Um, but it's more of a missed opportunity than a criticism. I
Sure.
would say. As we're sort of getting towards our wind
Yeah.
down, I'm curious because you're talking about how at the beginning of the discussion you said to me, you said Link Between
Yeah.
Worlds, Minish
Mm-hmm.
Cap, Echoes of
Yeah.
Wisdom. To you, this game's really
Yeah.
good. What's holding it back from being that number one?
Um, I guess I don't really know. I think,
Yeah,
yeah, I don't know.
I can answer
Oh, great.
first because it's also my
Sure.
third favorite 2D
Yeah, yeah.
Zelda.
What was your other one? You had Between
But
Worlds.
Link Between Worlds, Link's
Oh, okay,
Awakening
gotcha.
remake,
Yeah,
and then
yeah,
this
yeah.
game. I think what it just comes down to for me ultimately is that I think that the game doesn't really stick in the memory the way that these other
Okay.
games do.
Yeah.
And I think that it ultimately comes down to the fact that the the puzzles don't have this memorable quality to
Sure.
me, which I've already
Hmm.
discussed. Um, but also, I just don't think I prefer this playstyle.
Sorry.
You know, like
The like the echoes.
yeah,
Gotcha.
this
Yeah,
whole
yeah.
the whole
Sure.
thing, I just
Fair
don't
enough. Yeah.
prefer it. I mean, in my top 5 Zelda games, Breath of the Wild is the only one of the new era that's
Hmm.
in there. Well, I guess Link's Awakening, I guess, because it's the remake that I
Yeah.
love. I
Yeah.
don't really like the Game Boy version, but um, I think I ultimately love Echoes of Wisdom for providing me with this alternate way to play
Yeah.
Zelda that I didn't expect to
Yeah.
love, and I loved
Hmm.
anyway. But even though I love it, it's not to me on the same level of finesse
Sure. Yeah. Totally.
and and execution as these other games. All of all of these other games to me are five
Hmm.
star games, but those are like an unimpeachable 5 stars. This is a
It's pretty
5 star that I
peachable.
think if I were to play in a couple of years, it could
Yeah.
lower a
Sure.
little bit because I think that while I love the sort of Pikmin sensibility to the
Hmm.
combat, it's definitely not as engaging
Sure.
as just being
Yeah.
Link and like doing the final dungeon where I'm fighting alongside
Mhm.
Link. I'm like, damn, it looks like Link's having more fun
Yeah,
than I
yeah.
am.
He also gets to use his abilities like way faster than you would as Sword
Yeah.
Fighter, which is funny.
And so I find myself loving the immediacy, the freedom, the handheld feeling of
Yeah,
design, the art direction, music, which we can talk about in a minute. I think sort of wrap things
totally.
out entirely. But I just find myself ultimately returning to my initial question, which is about this
Hmm.
regression to classic Zelda, and me just always preferring that
Sure,
that
totally
that
fair.
spirit. And this game, as much as I loved how it split the
Hmm.
difference, it reminded me that when we don't split the difference at all, I have even
Sure,
more fun.
yeah. No, I think that's yeah, that totally makes sense, and I think I I I think I just haven't thought about this game as much.
Yeah,
But I'm glad you actually asked me that because I think that I potentially end up on slightly opposite side of the coin of you of where this game does what I always like the most about Nintendo games is that willingness
sure.
to reinvent that I feel these Zelda has always balanced the line in an interesting and compelling way, but I think a slightly unsatisfying way for me, where it is very dedicated to those tropes and very dedicated to largely across the history of the series, more similar combat and storylines and things. Echo's Wisdom does buck that. And so that is very exciting to me. And so I think that it's not my favorite now, but I think I could see it being my favorite in the future,
Sure.
just because this is the one that did it different, and that's always what I'm hungry for. Is that thing that does the thing different. So yeah, I don't know exactly where I feel. They're all
Yeah.
very similar in my mind. Um, yeah, I don't know. I don't have a specific answer to that.
I mean, we're also
The game came
we're
out
barely
2 weeks ago. Yeah,
yeah, we've barely gotten into it.
yeah. So it's okay to be, not sure yet. I
And I think that this is one that will be really interesting to see the long tail
Absolutely,
conversation of
yeah,
for
totally.
sure.
Because it'll also be interesting to see if this gets a sequel, if we see another Echo style or
Yeah.
Zelda playable game on the next system, on the system after that, whatever, we don't know. But for this moment, I think these three games are really fascinating to me because I think they all serve different purposes and have different design
Yeah.
intents, and I've really enjoyed all three of them. And to me, this is another continuation of what I've thought is so refreshing and interesting about Switch in terms of game design. Is it's a reinvention of a very traditional thing. You have the same art style as the 2019 game. It's top down like the traditional Zelda game, but this game is very differently designed from the historical
Yeah.
2D Zelda, top down Zelda, and that's really fresh. I did quickly want to mention something I kind of half mentioned earlier. Uh, the idea of this being a mirror of the Link narrative. I'm going back to the story or the characterization thing real quick,
Yeah.
because the thing that drew that most into my mind is you get to watch other people talk about Link, and you're not Link,
Right.
and almost none of them care. All these like side characters are like, oh, it's not like that's a kid with the sword, right? Like there are a few that like, oh, I remember him, whatever. But I think that kind of drills down to, I guess, supporting the criticism that I've always had about not feeling that Link is particularly interesting, or that his narrative or characterization is not particularly interesting, because you get to be someone else looking in from the outside, where it's like, oh yeah, Link, he's like a kid he got the sword, right? And it's like, yeah, that's how I always felt. But I do want to talk about where I think the game on a character's level is a little bit stronger is in the side characters and the towns and their personalities and things. I
Yeah.
think it's not the best, but I think it's consistently very fun. I love the Zora story with the two captains from the different tribes that are dueling, and they don't want to play music together because they kind of want to one up one another, and helping them kind of reconnect. That was really fun. It's not very in depth, but I love the Deku storyline where they have the fucking
Yeah.
cotton candy and they're like addicted to it, and you gotta like kind of pull them out of that. And I liked but didn't love the story of the young Goron chief who was trying to like come into his own, and his father had recently died and had him this like tablet of rules. I thought that was fun. And then there's the Yeti that you meet on top of the mountain that has a fun little story. And so they're just all these little stories that I thought were clever, cute, fun, had nice animations. I love all the characters' designs, especially the Dekus who all have like little different leaf facial hair and hair patterns and stuff.
Yeah.
The game on a personality level, it doesn't come from Zelda, but I always found that I was stumbling into a little area with funny little guys with funny little stories.
100%. I mean, Conde is one of my favorite Zelda characters
Yeah,
now. The Yeti. I love him. I think that he had the best, most heartfelt narrative of all of
yeah,
them. They're obviously all in some ways very formulaic
yeah,
stories, teaching, particularly I would say a younger audience lessons, particularly the young
yeah,
Goron
yeah.
chief.
And the Zora one to a
You
certain
know,
extent as well. It's like, hey,
yeah,
try to talk things through first, I guess. Like, don't get too hot
yeah.
headed.
It's about getting along. It's about finding your own way. It's a lot. It's simple story beats, but I think that are all
Hmm.
executed well, and they're all just. And this is sort of my final point on the game. They're all just really lovingly and beautifully
Totally.
rendered in this art
Hmm.
style that I think is far more expressive than it was
Yeah,
in the Link's Awakening
absolutely.
remake. It's far more detailed. I think the OST is my second
It's
favorite in the
phenomenal.
whole series, behind only Wind Waker, which for
Yeah.
me is like a
Oh,
Hall of
absolutely.
Fame
Absolutely.
soundtrack. But I think that the craftsmanship in the visuals and in the sound is exceptional, and I think gives the game a lot of the heart that maybe the script doesn't or
Mhm.
can't.
Yeah, yeah, totally. The aesthetic of this game is another great strength of it, and I think that again, the the aesthetic of this game is something that compels me because it pushes me to think about game design and budgeting and production and things like that, because I'm like, yeah, they reused a lot of the same assets from Link's Awakening. The trees are the same, the models of the house are the same. You go in because the tables are probably, I mean, I'm sure if I went back and played Link's Awakening, I would notice in the environment each of these little bits that, oh, I can echo that in the future game. But I think that's
Yeah.
really, really smart in that all of this, it is a new map, even though it does largely follow the Hyrule landmarks. Um, the map is different, the aesthetic is the same, but again, I agree with you. I think that it works a little bit better here because I think it balances. Interesting enough, I think the color palette is just slightly more rich here. A little bit of bigger variance of location design because Kohala Island is basically just a forest. And so seeing a wider variety of locations in like snow area and things here, I think definitely shows a wider breadth of the art direction. I think that the moment to moment design of these little areas is
Yeah.
really really cool. Um, every house has like its own little design. There's like little ivy growing on the sign that's hanging across the guy's shop. You go into the buildings; they all have this totally decked out, intricate place that they're living that feels very believable. And the overworld is just full of little things, like little guys crawling around and butterflies fluttering about and different colored flowers that pepper the forests, um, that make it feel very inviting and colorful in the way that I love a
Yeah.
field in a Ghibli movie. This game kind of has that energy to me, where it's a charming, really colorful little place.
And that's really important because the last thing I'll say to wrap up is why I love this game so much, despite all of my
Hmm.
hangups with it, is that I just think that in the toy box sensibility of it, in the how inviting, as you're saying, charming the world design is, and how fun these immediate puzzles are to solve, there's just a really great whimsical vibe to
Yeah, totally.
playing. And I think that this game really uses the term playing in a
Mm,
more literal and childlike way than we use when you talk about, okay, I'm playing The Last
mhm.
of Us. The act of playing there is very different than the act of
Yeah,
play
sure.
here. And I think that the way that it embodies
Totally.
play is very
Yeah.
special. And so I don't know if I would really want to see Grezzo make a direct sequel
Mhm.
to this game. I don't know if the idea stretched that
Yeah, yeah,
far,
I
but
agree.
what I would like to see is them take the same underlying philosophy and say, what's a different way we can evoke this same
Totally.
spirit? But yeah, I think this is a great game, and I'm going to give it two
A
thumbs
two
up.
thumbs up. I'm gonna do this is a four thumbs up review. Look at that. Look at us. Look at that. You're breathing in like you had something to say. You waiting for me to hit the button so you
I
can
like
say something nasty?
I like
Uncouth?
breathing.
Oh.